Geoffrey's bad enough, but I'm glad I wasn't married to Jesus. The lesson this morning was the business in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus prays and the disciples keep falling asleep. He wakes them up and says, "Could you not watch with me 1 hour? It's like my mother." I overslept this morning, flung on a cardigan and got there just as everybody was standing up. It was Holy Communion, so the militants were out in force. The sub-zero temperatures in the side chapel doubtless adding to the attraction. Geoffrey kicks off by apologising for his failure to defrost the church. Subdued merriment. Mr. Medlicott has shingles, Geoffrey explains, and as is well known, has consistently refused to initiate us lesser mortals into the mysteries of the boiler. Helpless laughter. Mrs. Belcher read the lesson. Mr. Belcher took the plate round. "Big day for you," I said to them afterwards. The sermon was about sex. I didn't actually nod off, though I have heard it before. Marriage gives the okay to sex is the gist of it, but while it is far from being the be-all and end-all, you can say that again, sex is nevertheless the supreme joy of the married state and a symbol of everything in our lives we are offering to God. So, Geoffrey concludes, when we put our money in the plate, it is a symbol of everything in our lives we are offering to God, and that includes our sex. I could only find 10p. Thinking about the sermon during the hymn, I felt a pang of sympathy for the deity, gifted with all this sex. No fun being made a present of the rare and desiccated conjunctions that take place between Geoffrey and me, or the frightful collisions that presumably still occur between the Belchers. Not to mention whatever shamefaced fumblings go on between Miss Budd and Miss Pantock. It's all right if we offer it to God, Alice. Well, if you say so, Pauline. Amazing scenes at the church door. Geoffrey had announced that after Easter the bishop would be paying us a visit, so the fan club were running round in small circles. Miss Frobisher even going so far as to squeeze my elbow. Meanwhile, Geoffrey stands there, the wind billowing out his surplice and ruffling his hair, what the who's who in the Diocese of Ripon call his schoolboy good looks. I help put the books away while he does his underneath this cassock I am but a man like anybody else act. Such a live wire, says Mrs. Belcher, really putting the parish on the map. Quite right, burbles Mrs. Shrubsole, looking at me. We must cherish him. We get home and I cherish him with some chicken wings in a tuna fish sauce. He said, "That went down well." I said, "My chicken wings?" He said, "My sermon." Felt it hit the nail on the head. He put his hand over mine, hoping, I suppose, that having hit one nail, he might hit another, but I said I had to go round with the parish magazine. "Good girl," he said. "Well, I can attack my paperwork instead." Roads busy, Sunday afternoons, families out for a run, wheeling the pram, walking the dog. Living. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open and for whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of thy Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love thee and worthily magnify thy glorious name, and not spend Sunday afternoons parked in a lay-by on the ring road wondering what happened to our life. When I got back, Geoffrey was just off to evensong. Was I going to come? When I said no, he said, really? Then I'd better pretend you have a headache. Why? One of the unsolved mysteries of life, or unsolved mysteries of my life anyway, is why the vicar's wife is expected to go to church at all. A barrister's wife doesn't have to go to court. An actor's wife is not at every performance, so why have I always forever got to be on parade? Not to mention the larger question of whether one believes in God in the first place. It's assumed that being a vicar's wife one must, but the question never actually comes up. Not with Geoffrey anyway. I can understand why, of course, to look at me. The hair, the flat chest, the one smile. Some of you might think I was just cut out for God. Maybe I am. I'd just like to have been asked, that's all. Could be Geoffrey doesn't believe in God either. I've always longed to ask him. Geoffrey, I'd say, do you really believe in God? I mean, cards on tables, you don't actually, do you? God's just a job to you like any other. You have to bring home the bacon somehow. But no, never a word. Not that it matters, of course. So long as you can run a tight jumble sale, you can believe in what you like. After he'd gone, I discovered we were out of sherry, so I've just popped round to the off-licence. Woman served me. Didn't smile. Can't think why I spend enough. We were discussing the ordination of women. Should women take the services? So long as it doesn't have to be me, I wanted to say. They could be taken by a trained gorilla. Oh yes, Geoffrey chips in. Susan's all in favour, aren't you, darling? She's keener than I am, aren't you, darling? More sprouts, anyone, I said. On the young side for a bishop, but he's been a prominent sportsman at university, so that would explain it. Boxing or rugby. Broken nose at some stage, anyway. One of the Christianity's Common Sense Brigade, and he refers to me throughout as Mrs. Vicar. Has beer with his lunch, and Geoffrey says he'll join him, which leaves me with the wine. Geoffrey's all over him because the rumour is that he's shopping around for a new archdeacon. Asks Jeff how outgoing I am. Actually says that. How outgoing is Mrs. Vicar? Mr. Vicar jumps in with a rundown of my accomplishments and an outline of my punishing schedule. On a typical day, apparently, I kick off by changing the wheel of the Fiesta. then hastened to the bedside of a dying pensioner, after which, having dispensed warmth and appreciation amongst sundry parishioners throughout, I top off a thrill-packed morning, taking round meals on wheels, somehow, and this to me is the miracle, says Geoffrey, somehow managing to rustle up a delicious lunch in the interim. The ladies, says the bishop, where would we be without them? Disaster strikes as I'm doling out the tinned peaches. The jug into which I've decanted the carnation milk suddenly gets knocked over. Geoffrey, for whom turning the cheek is all part of the job, claims that it knocked his elbow. His lordship takes the same line, insisting he gets doused in carnation milk practically every day of his life. Still, as I get the dishcloth and sponge off his gaiters, I catch him giving me a funny look. It's Mary Magdalene and the Nivea cream all over again. After lunch, Geoffrey's supposed to be taking him on a tour of the parish, but as we're having a cup of instant, the bishop suddenly claps his head to his forehead and remembers he's supposed to be in Keighley blessing a steam engine. We're stacking the dishwasher, and I asked Jeff how he thinks it's gone. Doesn't know. Fingers crossed, I say. I think there are more constructive things we can do than that, he says crisply, and goes off to mend his inner tube. I sit by the Arga for a bit. And as I doze off, it comes to me that by constructive things it perhaps means prayer. When I wake up, there's a note from Geoffrey. Gone to speak at the ladies' bright hour, go to bed. I'm not sleepy. And anyway, we're running low on sherry, so I drive into Leeds. I stop going round the corner as I owe them a bit on the side, and she's always so surly. There's a little Indian place I found behind the infirmary. Newsagents, basically, but they sell drink and anything really the way they do. Open last thing at night, Sundays included, my ideal. Ramesh, he's called. Mr. Ramesh, I call him, though Ramesh might be his Christian name. Only not Christian, of course. I've been there once or twice now, only this time he sits me in the back place on a sack of something and talks. Little statuette of a god on the wall. A god, not the god, not the definite article. One of several thousand, apparently. Safety in numbers, I say. Though he doesn't understand. He looks a bit more fun than Jesus anyway. Shows me some pictures of other gods getting up to all sorts. I said, she looks a very busy lady. Is that yoga? He said, well, it helps. He's quite athletic himself, apparently. But married. Only his wife's only about 14, so they won't let her in. He calls me Mrs. Vicar too. Only it's different. He has lovely teeth. Once upon a time, I had my life planned out, or half of it at any rate. I wasn't too sure about the first part, but at the stroke of 50, I was all set to be a wonderful woman, or to turn into a wonderful woman, or something. Wife to a doctor, or a vicar's wife. Chairman of the parish council, a pillar of the WI, and ultimately a wise, witty and white-haired old lady who stands on her own feet until one day she comes out of the county library, falls under the weight of her improving book, breaks a hip and dies peacefully, continently and without fuss under a snowy coverlet in the cottage hospital. And coming away from her funeral on a bright winter's afternoon in a country churchyard, people would say, well, she was a wonderful woman. Had this been a serious ambition of mine, I should have seen to it I was equipped with the skills necessary to its achievement. How to produce jam after reaching a good rolling boil successfully coats the spoon. How to whip up a Victoria sponge that just gives to the fingertips. How to plan, execute and carry through a successful garden fete. All weapons in the armoury of any upstanding Anglican lady. But I can do none of these things. I'm even a fool at the flower arranging. If you think squash is a competitive activity, try flower arranging. I ought to have a PhD in the subject, the number of classes I've been to, but still my efforts look or show as much evidence of art as walking sticks in an umbrella stand. Actually, it's temperament. I don't have it. Try flower arranging. On this particular day, the rota has Miss Frobisher and Mrs. Belcher down for the side aisles, and I'm paired with Mrs. Shrubsole to do the altar and the lectern. My honest opinion, never voiced, needless to say, is that if they were really sincere about religion, they'd forget flower arranging altogether. Invest in some permanent plastic jobs and put the money to the current most popular famine. However, at around midday, I wander over to the church with a few dog-eared chrysanthemums. They look as if they could do with an immediate drink, so I call in at the vestry and root out a vase or two in the cupboard where Geoffrey keeps the communion wine. It not looming very large on my horizon. I assume that I'm doing the altar and Mrs. Shrubsole the lectern. But when I come out of the vestry, Mrs. Shrubsole is already at the altar, well embarked on her arrangement. I said, I thought I was doing the altar. No, she said, I think Mrs. Belcher will bear me out. I'm down to do the altar. You are doing the lectern. Why? She smiled sweetly. Do you have a preference? The only preference I have is to stick my chrysanthemums up her nose. But instead I practice a bit of Christian forbearance and go and stick them in a vase by the lectern. In the best traditions of my floral arrangements, they look like the poles of a wigwam, so I go over and see if Mrs. Belcher has a bit of backing going, begging. But Are you using this? I say, picking up a bit of mouldy old fern. I certainly am. I need all my spirea, it gives it body. So I go over and see if Miss Frobisher has a bit of greenery going begging, but she's doing a Japanese number, a vase like a test tube, half filled with gravel, into which she's throttling a lone carnation. So I retire to the vestry for a bit to calm my shattered nerves, and when I come out, ready to tackle my chrysanthes again, Mrs. Shrubsole has apparently finished and has fetched the other two up to the altar to admire her handiwork. So I wander over and take a look. Well, it's a brown job. Beech leaves, teasels, grass, that school of thought. Mrs. Shrubsole is saying it's called Forest Murmurs. It's what I did for me highly commended in Harrogate last year. What do you think? Gert and Daisy are, of course, speechless with admiration, but when I tentatively suggest that it might look a bit better if she cleared up all these bits and pieces, she said, "What bits and pieces?" I said, "All these acorns and fir cones and whatnot. What's this conquering made of?" She said, "Leave that. The whole arrangement pivots round that." I said, "Pivots?" When the adjudicator was commenting on my arrangement, he specifically, when the adjudicator was commenting on my arrangement, he particularly singled out the hint I gave of the forest floor. I said, "Mrs. Shrubsole, this is the altar of St. Michael and all angels. It is not the wind in the willows." Mrs. Belcher said, "I think you ought to sit down." I said, "I do not want to sit down." I said, "It's all very well transforming the altar into something out of Bambi, but do not forget that for the vicar, the altar is his working surface. Furthermore," I added, "if the vicar was to sink to his knees in prayer, which since this is the altar is wont to do, is quite likely to get one of these diesel things in his eye. This is not a booby trap. This is not a flower arrangement. It's a booby trap, a health hazard. Permit me to demonstrate." And I begin getting down on my knees to show her how pointless a bloody lethal a bloody Forest Murmurs is. Only I must have slipped, because the next thing I'm rolling down the altar steps and end up banging my head on the communion rail. Mrs. Shrubsole, who along with every other organisation known to man has been in the St. John's Ambulance Brigade, wants me left lying down, whereas Mrs. Belcher is all for getting me onto a chair. Leave them lying down and they inhale their own vomit. It happens all the time, Veronica. Only, Muriel, says Mrs. Shrubsole, if they have vomited. She hasn't vomited. No, I said, but I will have to listen to any of more of this drivel, and I start to get up. Is that blood, Veronica? Well, says Mrs. Shrubsole, reluctant to concede to Mrs. B on anything remotely touching medicine. It could be. What we need is a cup of hot, sweet tea. I thought that theory had been discredited, says Mrs. Belcher. Discredited or not, it sends Miss Frobisher streaking off to find a tea bag. And also, as it subsequently transpires, to telephone all and sundry in an effort to locate Geoffrey. He is in York, taking part in the usual interdenominational conference on some hitherto uncolonised department of life, underfloor central heating perhaps. He comes haring back, thinking I'm at death's door, then realising I'm not, has nothing more constructive to offer than a take a nap. This gives the fan club the green light to invade the vicarage, making endless tea and the vicarage lunch, and, as he puts it, spoiling him rotten, whilst this also licenses them to do a complete fact-finding survey of the housekeeping arrangements. Where does she keep the Duraglit, vicar? A good time is had by all. Meanwhile, Emily Bronte is laid out on the sofa in a light doze. I come round to hear Geoffrey saying, "Mrs. Shrubsole's going now, darling." I don't get up, never even open my eyes. I just wave and say, "Goodbye, Mrs. Shrubsole." Only thinking about it as I drift back off, I think I might have said, "Goodbye, Mrs. Subsoil." Anyway, I meant the other, shrub soil. When I woke up, it was dark. Geoffrey had gone out. Couldn't find a thing in the cupboards, so I got the car out and drove into Leeds. I sat in the shop for a bit, not saying much, and then I felt a bit wainy and Mr. Ramesh let me lie down in the back place. I must have dozed off because when I woke up, Mr. Ramesh had come in and started taking off all his clothes. I said, "What are you doing? What about the shop?" He said, "Do not worry about the shop. I have closed the shop." I said, "But it's only 9, you don't close till 11. He said, "I do tonight." I said, "What's tonight?" He said, "A chance in a million. A turn-up for the box. Will you take your clothes off, please?" And I did. You never see pictures of Jesus smiling, do you? I mentioned this to Geoffrey once. "Good point, Susan," is what he said, which made me wish I'd never brought it up in the first place. He said I should think of our Lord as having an inward smile. The doctrine, according to Geoffrey, being that Jesus was made man so that he smiled and laughed and did everything else like the rest of us. "Do you think he ever smirked?" I said, at which point he suddenly remembered he was burying someone in 5 minutes and took himself off. If Jesus was all man, I just wish they'd show more of it in the illustrations. I was sitting in church wrestling with this point of theology when it suddenly occurred to me that something seemed to have happened to Geoffrey. The service should have kicked off ages ago and he's still in the vestry. Mr. Bland is filling in with something uplifting on the organ. Miss Frobisher, never one to let an opportunity slip, has slumped to her knees in a spot of unscheduled silent prayer. Mrs. Shrubsole is lost in contemplation of the altar, still adorned with forest murmurs, a trail of ivy round the cross now, the final inspired touch. Mr. Bland now ups the volume, but still no sign of Jeff. "Arnold," says Mrs. Belcher, "there seems to be some hiatus in the proceedings, and suddenly the fan club is on red alert. She's just levering him to his feet when I get in there first to investigate. His Reverence is there, every cupboard open and practically in tears. He said, 'Have you seen it?' I said, 'What?' He said, 'The wine, the communion wine, it's gone.' I said, 'Well, that's no tragedy,' and offered to pop out and get a bottle of ordinary. He said, 'They're not open. Besides, what does it look like?' I said, 'Well, it looks like we've run out of communion wine.' He said, 'We have not run out. There was a full bottle there on Friday. Somebody has drunk it.' It's on the tip of my tongue to say, well, if Jesus is all he's cracked up to be, why doesn't he use tap water and put it to the test? When I suddenly remember that Mr. Bland keeps a bottle of cough mixture in his cupboard in case any of the choir boys gets chesty. At the thought of celebrating the Lord's Supper in Benelin, Geoffrey now has a nervous breakdown. But as I point out, it's red and it's sweet and nobody's going to notice. Nor do they. I see Mr. Belcher licking his lips a bit thoughtfully as he goes back up the aisle, but that's all. What was the hold-up, asked Mrs. Shrubsole. Nothing, I say. Just a little hiccup. Having got it right for a change, I'm feeling quite pleased with myself. Only Geoffrey obviously isn't, because he never speaks all afternoon, so I bunk off Evensong and drive into Leeds. Mr. Ramesh is obviously expecting me because there's a bed made up in the storeroom upstairs. I go up first and get in. When I put my hand out, I can feel the lentils running through my fingers. Then he comes up and he's in his special dress, long white shirt, sash, loincloth underneath, all spotless like Jesus, only not. I watch him undress and I think of them all there at Evensong and Geoffrey praying in that pawsy way that he does, giving you a chance to mean every word, and the fan club lapping it up, thinking they love God when they just love Geoffrey. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, and by thy great mercy defend us from all the perils and dangers of this night, like Mr. Ramesh, 26, with wonderful legs, that goes swimming every morning in Merrion Street baths and plays hockey for Horsforth. I ask him if they offer their sex to God. He's not very interested in the subject, but for them, from what I can gather, sex is all part of God. And I can see why too. For the first time, I actually know what all the fuss is about. There, among the mental lentils, on the second Sunday after Trinity. I've just popped into the vestry. He's put a lock on the cupboard door. I stand up and say, my name is Susan. I am a vicar's wife, and I am an alcoholic. And then I tell my story, or some of it anyway. Don't pull any punches, says Clem, my counsellor. Nobody's going to be shocked. Believe me, love, they've all been there. But I don't tell them about Mr. Ramesh because they've not been there. Listen, people, I was so drunk that I used to go and sleep with an Asian grocer. Yes. And you won't believe this. I loved it. Loved every minute. Dear, oh dear. This is a real drunken lady. So I draw a veil over Mr. Ramesh, who once on the feast of St. Simon and St. Jude, choral evensong at 6, daily services at the customary hour, put makeup on his eyes and bells on his ankles, and naked, except for his little belt. danced in the back room of his shop with a tambourine. So how did you come to AA, they ask. My husband, I say, the vicar. He persuaded me. But I lie. It was not my husband, it was Mr. Ramesh. The exquisitely delicate and polite Mr. Ramesh, who one Sunday night turned his troubled face towards me and with its struggling moustache asked if he might take the bull by the horns and inquire if intoxication is a prerequisite for sexual intercourse, or whether or not it was only when I was going to bed with him. The beautiful Mr. Ramesh, 26, with wonderful legs. Whether it was only with him that I had to be inebriated. Or was it, asked this slim, flawless, untroubled creature, was it perhaps his colour? Because if not, he would like to float the suggestion that sober might be even nicer. And so the credit for the road to Damascus goes to Mr. Ramesh, whose first name turns out also to be Ramesh. Ramesh, a member of the Community Council and Leeds Federation of Trade. Of course, none of this I say, only when it becomes plain to Geoffrey, and it takes all of 3 weeks, that Mrs. Vicar is finally on the wagon. And who is it that gets the credit? Not one of Mr. Ramesh's jolly little gods busy doing everything under the sun to one another, much like Mr. Ramesh. Oh no, it's full marks to Geoffrey's chum, the deity, moving in his well-known mysterious ways. So, now everything has changed. For the moment, I am a new woman. And Geoffrey is a new man. And he brings it up at the slightest pretext. My wife's an alcoholic, you know. He brings it, he mentioned it on Prayers Answered the other day, when he revealed that he and the fan club have been having these jolly get-togethers into what he, and into where they've prayed into what he calls my secret. Practically sent me racing back to the Tio Pepe, even to think of it. The fans, of course, are furious. They think it's brought us closer together. Geoffrey thinks that too. He brought it up. We were at some doleful jamboree, and I'm stuck there clutching my grapefruit juice as he tells the tale to some bearded cleric. We met it with love, he cries, as if love was some all-purpose antibiotic, which to Geoffrey it probably is. And so it goes on, the mileage in it endless. He brought it up on the conference for the supportive parish. He's now given it a new, gales of liberated, caring laughter. He's now given it a new twist and tells it as if he's talking about a parishioner. And then at the end he says, friends, I want to tell you something. That drunken flower arranger was my wife. Silence. Then the applause, terrific. I caught some of the upwardly mobile parsons sneaking me a look now and again and thinking, why weren't they smart enough to marry an alcoholic, or better still, a drug addict? Problem wives that they can do a nice redemption job on right there on their own doorsteps, because there's no stopping Geoffrey now. He grabs my hand in public, nay, brandishes it. We're a team, he cries. He looks certain to become rural dean, and that's only the beginning. As the bishop says, just the sort of person we're looking for on the bench, somebody with a seasoned compassion, somebody who's looked life in the face, somebody who's been there. Mr. Ramesh has sold his shop. I went down there on Sunday and there was a boy writing under new management on the window. Spelt wrong. And something in Hindi spelt right, no doubt. They do that, of course. Asians. Get something going, build it up nicely, then take the profits and move on. It's a good thing. And we ought to be more like that, more enterprising. My group meets twice a week and I go religiously. That's what it is, of course. The names have changed. It's Frankie and Steve, Susie and Clem, but it's actually Miss Frobisher and Mrs. Shrubsole all over again. I never liked going to one church, so now I'm going to two. Geoffrey would call that the wonderful mysteries of God. I call it bad taste. And I wouldn't do it to a dog. But that's the thing nobody ever says about God. He has no taste at all. Thank you for watching. Love from Helen.